My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. For many people, their former religious doctrines have begun to feel like an old pair of tight pants. You can hop, shimmy, and try to cram yourself in, but you can't deny that they no longer fit. Healthy spirituality shouldn't be kept in a space too small or narrow. It's natural for it to grow and evolve along with us. That journey can be initially terrifying, but ultimately liberating. My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, John Pavlovitz, says it's time to unbox God, re-examine your faith, and love your damn neighbor. John Pavlovitz is a pastor, writer, and activist from Wake Forest, North Carolina. He's spent nearly 3 decades teaching, studying, dissecting, deconstructing, and reconstructing the Christian faith. Committed to equality, diversity, and justice, John aims to teach a single elemental truth. Faith in a supernatural being should make you a better human being. His blog, Stuff That Needs to Be Said, recently surpassed 100 million views, and his previous books include A Bigger Table, Hope and Other Superpowers, and Low. His website is johnpavlovitz.com, and he joins me this week to share his latest book, If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited Pastor John Pavlovitz. Welcome, John.
Victor, it is wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And John, you open your book by referring to yourself as a longtime Christian by aspiration, if not always by practice. Please share your early path, how it led to your calling, and your unique definition of your personal spirituality.
I grew up in the Roman Catholic faith, and that was a huge part of my life growing up. And as many people do, I began to sort of stretch my spiritual muscles as I entered college and wanted to have a faith that I could really claim for my own, and went through the searching process and kind of meandered in and out of organized religion during that time. And my story was really one of being surprised by a calling into ministry. I was doing some volunteer work for a church where I was married, and then just found that I had this love for working with teenagers. And as I always say, as I began to teach them about a faith that I didn't really have at the time, my faith began to grow, and that set me down a path of ministry life for the past 2.5 decades in various forms.
So what do you say Christian by aspiration, if not always in practice?
Well, I think it's presumptuous to call myself a Christian, because that means that I am, replicating Christ or emulating Christ. And that's always the goal. The teachings of Jesus are still central to my life. And so those are things that I hope to live into. But I realize that every day it's a matter of getting as much right as you can, and then getting up the next day and doing it all over again. And so realizing that we are all works in progress. And so I embrace that and don't shy away from it.
So it's our humanity that makes us that way.
It is. And I think part of it was the expectation that I had when I was younger, that there was this standard that I could never reach. And it left a trail of guilt. And I think for many people, religion at its worst does that. But then when I embraced the best part about spirituality was that recognizing my belovedness, then it changed everything for me. And then my failures and my missteps are all perfectly understandable, and they're just part of the learning process.
If Jesus walked among us today, what would he think of his flock?
I think he would be mystified at the mission drift of the church, the way that so many people have taken this message that 2,000 years ago was this, this movement of empathy. And it was really a movement of the street, of people living in community together and interdependent community. And then how it became something that really leverages power so often. And I think it would be largely unrecognizable, that large church. I think what Jesus would be looking for would be the small and close relationships where people are still trying to live in their communities with compassion leading.
You've shared that he might say, "What didn't you understand, or what didn't you get?"
Yeah. The greatest commandment, that to love God and love your neighbor as yourself, and the idea that that's the one job you have. And if you miss love, you've missed the elemental part of what I was trying to ask you to do at this, during your life here. And that is the main thing that I try to make sure I get up every day, and that I am an agent of generosity and kindness and empathy. And if not, the book that I've written, it really states that if your faith doesn't make you more compassionate, then what's the point of it? That it's really of no use to you or to people who encounter you.
Absolutely. This is your fifth book. You've written about religion and politics, race and grief, and all sorts of social justice issues. What fueled the creation of this particular book at this particular time?
Well, Victor, I was writing a very different book. It dealt with some of the same issues, but it was much more of kind of diagnosing this really toxic religion. And as I began writing, I started writing in March of 2020. And of course, what started to happen with this news story off in the distance about this little public health issue, and it got larger and larger, and I couldn't avoid it any longer. And as 2020 kind of wound on, I was looking around at people's response to the pandemic and looking at the strife over the Black Lives Matter protests and counter protests and the coming election. And I was seeing so much enmity, and it was coming from so many people who claim the same Christian faith that I claim. And so there was a grieving in there, and I felt as though I needed to respond in real time to it. And that really shaped a very different book, a book that I think is much more visceral and much more intimate than it would have been any other way. And it became really a journal, kind of a travel diary of living through this time through the lens of my spirituality.
Why did you choose the title, "If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk," instead of "If God is Love, Love People"?
Yeah, I think my aspirations for humanity had become really pedestrian. I think I was looking around and looking at a group of people that I thought were so far from the original plot of Jesus that I said, well, if I can't get them to love, maybe I can get them to do no harm. If we could start there at that really elemental place of not wanting to injure people, and really having people examine the ways that their blind spots and their prejudices and phobias have leaked into their religion and are doing damage. And if we can do some of that work, then maybe we can move to a place of understanding and then of love. So part of it was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek take on that message, but also just saying, let's start there. Let's start, and then we'll work our way toward that deeper love.
And it's interesting, you have a wonderful sense of humor, and Don't Be a Jerk is part of that. And just to give the listeners an idea of some of your chapter headings, The Church of Not Being Horrible, God Fund Me, and Love Your Damn Neighbor. I love your titles.
And I think that it's important because the work that I do and the themes that I write, they're often, they're very heavy. And people can have the misconception that I am a heavy human being, that I'm always, frowning and carrying this sort of dread. And I'm really not. There's a joy to life. And I do love living, and I love people. And I wanted to make sure that was part of this story and a part of this book, that people could laugh in the midst of really important conversations.
As I shared with you before we started, I attended interfaith seminary in the 1990s, and in my interfaith studies, I found that virtually every faith has some form of the golden rule. Have some Christians forgotten this? And how may it be both remembered and embraced?
I think we have to be people of stories. We have to remember that whenever we encounter a human being, whether they're religious or not, whether they share anything that we think is in common with us or not, that they are a once in history, never to be repeated story. And if we can honor that and respect the uniqueness of their journey, that they are unprecedented, then I think we can begin to have a posture of love toward them. So much of, I think, what religion does at its worst, but also what we do culturally, is we want to have a shorthand for people. We want to caricaturize them and summarize them quickly because that's easier than actually getting to know people. And I think so the golden rule, and that comes when we respect the story in front of us and don't assume that we know anything about that story until we actually ask.
And you're touching upon this idea of othering. Why do you think so many folks do that?
I think there's two primary motives, I think, that push us through life often, and they're grief and fear. And they can motivate us to do all sorts of things. And I think fear tends to be something that we become almost addicted to, that we have. Many people have a religion that needs an enemy, that needs an adversary, and it forces people to walk around in a battle posture. And I always try to remind myself that I better not go through life with two clenched fists. I need at least one hand open to give and to receive and to show kindness. And I can fight for the things that I believe in, and we all should, but that I can't live constantly in battle. And that's what too many people, I think, do. And it makes it really difficult to show empathy to someone if we feel like we're in competition with them.
What does that also say about our respective self-worth?
I think it says that we are all people who have a deep need to be loved, and that gets manifested in so many different forms, usually in some sort of comparison sickness where we feel, I run into so many people whose religion has told them a story that someone else's gain is their loss. And that is such a sad way for people to go through life. And I think the best of humanity and the best of religion says we are interdependent here, and we succeed when the other succeeds. And I want that. The idea of shalom for me in the Old Testament is not just looking at someone and saying, I want the absence of bad for you, but I also want the abundance of good for you. And I want to be an instrument of that. Absolutely.
I had a wonderful teacher who once asked the class, what was the great sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? And that brought a few chuckles to the class. He then explained that the great sin was inhospitality, turning away the stranger in need of food and shelter. Is that a lesson that a good part of humanity needs to remember?
It's one that I know that the Christian church definitely needs to, because I run into that argument all the time. People will drop the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and then I will share that verse and let them know that was actually the crime was a callousness of heart. And we are so quick to miss how hardened we've become. It's almost impossible for us to see. And that's what I constantly do with the writing, is try to get people to stop and pause long enough to say, what is my motive? What do I intend to do today? I may hurt people inadvertently, but if I better not be hurting them intentionally and still say I'm a person of a God of love.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful word that comes out of certain parts of Africa. The word is Ubuntu, and it literally translates as I am because we are, stressing the importance of embracing community.
That's beautiful. And it's just the better path, Victor. I think people who do interfaith work or do work in justice or trying to find a way to bring communities together, it's just there's an exhale that happens when you're in a place where you're not striving to be better than someone and you're not trying to compare yourself and you want the best for them. It's really just an elevated place to live. And I think people resist it. And if they only could step into it for a little while, they'd understand why people like you and me advocate for loving others.
When I attended seminary, my mentor used to share that the word sin derived from the Hebrew word chet, meaning an archer drawing the bow, releasing the arrow, and missing the target. Does that resonate with you?
It does. And it's a lesson that I have learned over time that was a shift for me, because the idea of sin when I was a younger Christian, it was loaded with a sense of moral judgment and the threat of damnation. And then when I could see it as simply a missing the mark, a failure, a misstep, and I was doing this all in the eyes of a God who loved me, not one who wanted to squash me, it became a very different idea. So sin became for me just a chance to start again and to try again. And that's all it is. And there's nothing to fear in that. It's simply what that is.
You say that love the sinner, hate the sin is one of the single most unloving expressions there has ever been. How does that thought go astray?
I think it's one of the examples of us weaponizing religion or the scriptures. Those words are never in the Bible, but yet we use them, and it's usually used by someone who is saying, I feel morally superior to you. I'm going to let you know that, but I'm going to let you know I love you even though you're morally inferior to me. And if the minute you do that, you have declared yourself having oneness with God and the other as being separate. And I think there's just such a danger in that message, because what it says to someone is, not only do I disapprove of you, but God does. And the existential weight of that is so damaging.
Have you ever seen the situation comedy The Good Place?
I haven't. People tell me all the time that I need to, but I have never seen it.
The premise of The Good Place is that these folks arrive, they pass away, and they arrive at this place. And Ted Danson is the greeter there. And he basically tells them that they've arrived at the good place, and that only the best people arrive at the good place. And a couple of folks who arrived there seem to have been misplaced, because there are people there who are wonderful humanitarians and people who have volunteered and given their lives for others and so on and so forth. And there are a couple who have been really selfish and self-serving, and they're trying to figure out why they wound up in the good place. And it turns out that the good place is really not the good place. That they're being teased into thinking that they arrived at the good place. What's your definition tomorrow? If any of us left this world, what's your definition of what that next step would be like?
I would hope that it's a place where the striving is over, the striving to be perfect or to earn affection or approval. I think so many of us, myself included, never quite feel like we're worth it. That imposter syndrome, that streak runs through all of us. And what I imagine the good place would be is a place where you can just stop and breathe and be and know that that's good enough.
The concept being is that they're being told that they're in the good place, but they're actually being tortured because of the fear that they may be sent to the bad place. And they have these characters that represent the representatives of the bad place and the train to the bad place and the description of the tortures in the bad place and so on and so forth. And just the premise is just absolutely wonderful. And I think it starts people thinking about exactly what we're talking about. I've had this vision that for me personally, that heaven would be a place where everyone that I've ever known and ever loved would be there, and that we'd all support and take care of each other. And I think really that could be on earth, couldn't it?
That is the prayer that Jesus teaches is, let earth reflect heaven, let them be similar. And that's a different mindset for many people who were raised in a very orthodox conservative Christianity, which is focused more on the afterlife. And I embrace a theology. If Jesus was just about the afterlife, the Gospels would have been really short. It would have been just a simple altar call message, and that would have been it. But we have all these images of hundreds of stories of Jesus' life. And I think that shows that the way we live and the relationships we have, they really matter. They are extremely spiritual. And so that could be what we do. We could have those things that we dream of having one day. We could make those happen here.
Absolutely. My guest is John Pavlovitz. His book is called If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, Finding a Faith That Makes Us Better Humans. John, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your wonderful work.
Well, if you can spell my name, John Pavlovitz, Pavlovitz, you'll probably find me because there's not a lot of us in the world. And you find johnpavlovitz.com or my name in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all those places, Victor.
And your book can be found, I assume, Amazon and all places where great books are sold.
That is correct.
And we'll be back with more after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Hey, Dad, your prescription will be ready in just a minute. Hey, Dad, your laundry will be ready in just a minute. Dad, your lunch will be ready in just a minute.
Hey, honey, why don't you take a minute? When you help care for a loved one, you give them as much time as you can. But it's just as important to take time for yourself. AARP can help. Find free care guides to support you and your loved one at aarp.org/caregiving. That's aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that our daughters have what they need to grow and learn. But that isn't the case for nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. that struggle with hunger.
Childhood hunger is a heartbreaking reality that Feeding America is working to change. Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste and provides it to families and children in need.
You can help kids in need in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Pastor John Pavlovitz. His book, If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, Finding a Faith That Makes Us Better Humans. John, you argue that hell is incompatible with a loving God, and that it's time that Christians evolve from old-time religion and using fear to promote compliance. How do we move from fire, brimstone, and eternal damnation to love and eternal light?
Victor, for me, it started with imagining that God is as big as people told me that God was all knowing and all powerful and all loving. And if this God is all of those things, then that God is going to be able to outlove and outforgive and outweight me. And once I could embrace that idea, then the idea of that God trying to damage me or test me or getting tired of me, when that evaporated, I was no longer terrified by God. And no one is at their best when they're afraid. And I think as a parent, I want my children to listen to me. I want them to respect me, but I want them to feel safety in me. And the idea of hell really never made me feel safe in the presence of God. And but the presence of a love that holds us all should give us that feeling. We should be safe in that.
We talked a little bit about some of the interesting names of your chapters in your book, and maybe you can give us a little capsule on a couple of them. The Church of Not Being Horrible. What's the Church of Not Being Horrible?
Again, that was an example of saying, okay, they don't have to have the Church of Love. Let's start in the early stages. That may be a master's class. Let's do the entry level stuff here and say, what are the expressions of my religion that might be help making someone feel less welcomed or less seen or less respected? And if I can be really critical about my own life and see the ways that I am reflecting a God who might be angry or judgmental, if I can begin to soften the way that I see other people and become gentler toward them, then I'm going to move into a place of love. If I can, it's the idea that doctors making that oath of not wanting to harm, that is simply the place we start. We start by saying life is difficult on its best days. There's grief and there's suffering and there's pain. We should come and try to at least not cause that. We should be people who alleviate those things. Physicians,
the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. There should be an oath like that for people who are pastors and clergy folks, shouldn't there?
There should. And Victor, the key part is what I talk a lot about in the book is we have to be willing to listen to people who say, you are hurting me. And I think the church has not done a good job in many aspects of looking at vulnerable communities and listening to them as they say, your religious system is doing damage to me. It's harming my people. And we usually come into a defense posture rather than saying, I wonder why you feel that way. Rather than telling people they're wrong to feel judged or hurt, maybe we could look at what we might be doing that's causing them to feel that way.
Have we as a society stopped listening to one another?
We stopped listening to people who we believe are different than we are. That tribalism is so ingrained in us that I think we're all looking for any words that are going to tip us off or any social cues that can tell us, okay, this is one of my people or it's not. And that's a really dangerous way to evaluate people because we're almost always doing it with incomplete information. We're doing it from the distance of social media, or we're doing it from the distance of that real relationship removes. And until we have proximity to people, I think we're always going to be in danger of placing them in some sort of category that allows us to simply dismiss them.
And truly listening and hearing what someone else has to say and share without opining and without interjection.
Right. For me, growing up and hearing the stories of Jesus, I realized that he met with priest and with prostitute. He met with the religious elite and the street rabble, and he made them feel no one left Jesus without dignity, and he afforded that to them. And it wasn't about people who agreed with him. It was often people who vehemently disagreed with him. And that is something that's really difficult to live into, not just loving my enemy, but treating them humanely, even if they are acting inhumanely.
What about the chapter, God Fund Me?
That chapter leans into the ideas of trying to interpret suffering or bad circumstances and trying to psychoanalyze what God is telling you in those circumstances. It's so easy for people of faith to say very lazily, well, this is God saying that, or God must be trying to tell me something. And it really places so much pressure on all of us to go through life and to experience its pains and its pitfalls and to try to figure out why that might be happening. And it also examines the idea of prayer, intercessory prayer, of asking God to heal and assuming that God would not heal unless we ask God to heal. And that the idea of prayer, that sort of transactional prayer, was so deeply embedded in me and so many other people of faith. I began again to look at that and ask, would a God of love need to be convinced to move to alleviate suffering? And for me, the answer was, of course not.
There's a wonderful old story that one of my teachers shared about a young man who was growing up in Tsarist Russia. And as a child, he was raised in a Jewish home, and then he was taken away by the army at the time. And when he was in his late teens, he was walking through a village one day, and he passed a synagogue. And he heard the prayers coming from inside, and he recognized the songs. He did not recognize the words. So he had a sense that he should enter the building, and he did. And he sat in the back, and because he didn't know the words, but he loved the theme, the music, he started whistling. And everyone turned around and looked at him with this disgust and horror and demanded that the rabbi address him. And he came up, and Rabbi asked him, he said, "Son, why do you whistle here?" And he explained what happened. And he says, "Please go sit down again." And the congregation said, "Why aren't you going to punish this young man?" And the answer was, "If only our prayers meant as much to God as this boy's whistle."
Love that. Beautiful. And the idea of prayer changed for me over time, Victor. I shifted from asking God to do things for me and praying for the insight to be present in the world and be an agent of compassion and love and justice, so that the things that burdened me, I could at least be present in and do something about. So the prayers became, God, show me where I can change this plot, rather than having all the burden be on you to do it.
Absolutely. How may diverse communities enhance our faith dialogue?
No one really likes to be told that they are doing something that's injurious to another person, or that they are selfish or greedy or judgmental. And we need people who we trust enough to be able to tell us that. And often I found that spiritual communities that I was a part of as a pastor, that we claimed we were diverse, but ultimately, if someone was too left or too right or too needy or too loud or too rough around the edges, we pushed them to the periphery because we really wanted a comfortable, manageable diversity. And I think we need communities that are so diverse that they agitate us at times, because that is such a healthy thing. I come from a big Italian family, super loud. People always thought we were angry with each other, but we weren't. And that volume and that bombast was about passion and authenticity. We knew we could be completely ourselves. And that should be what happens in spiritual community. We shouldn't have to be edited versions of ourselves.
Earlier on in the interview, you mentioned how the pandemic basically was part of the inspiration for this book. What has been the effect of the COVID pandemic on communities of faith, and how has the response from some of the communities manifested with what you refer to as toxic theology?
I think you have seen the very best and the very worst of both humanity and politics and religion. I think what it has done in some communities is tried to give them, they've had to search for a narrative that allowed them to see someone as the cause or the enemy or the hindrance. And so they've used this time to actually retreat into a bunker of tribalism, rather than looking at the world and saying there is such an opportunity now to be a source of healing and welcome and rest. And so you've seen some communities who have embraced that, and some who have completely missed the chance to do it. And the work that I do is always trying to ask communities, how are you showing up in the world right now? I had a pastor one time, he said to our staff, if we closed our doors today, who would grieve the loss? Who would notice the loss other than people who come into our building for services? And we realized we were not impacting the community. We were so absent in the community that no one would grieve our loss. And I think right now, so many people need people of faith and communities of faith that they would miss were they not present.
And how do we go about detoxifying theology?
I think we have to be willing to let go of some of our old stories. The change in me happened when life began to argue with my theology, and I had to ask some hard questions. Was I going to allow myself to be informed by new experiences, or was I going to double down and plant my flag in something that maybe I didn't really believe anymore? So I think the more we're fearless in asking questions, the better we're going to be. And my feeling has always been that if God is God can handle my doubts and my change of heart and my vacillation, and God is not taken back by any of that. And I should be, and I am free to do that. People will get offended by our doubts and our change of hearts, but God would never.
You share that American evangelicalism is built on the faulty premise that God is a white, cisgender, heterosexual man, born in America, raised Christian, who votes Republican. Where does that leave those who are not?
The bad place, I think.
I think so.
I think, growing up, Victor, that idea was not explicitly preached, but it was there in so many of the messages and the cues that I was getting from ministers and people in the church. And there is a bias that develops against people who do not fit a very narrow set of qualifiers. And I think that's what you see in so much of the American church, a movement that is very insular and more white and middle class or upper middle class, that really looks at this diverse swath of humanity in front of it and has contempt for it rather than the compassion that Jesus has.
You offer that there are 3 ways that God transcends traditional gender definitions, homophobia, and misogyny. Please share.
Well, for me, I embraced the idea that God was not male, that there was nothing about God that could be, that needed to be designated by a particular gender. And once I embraced the idea that God would be non-binary, because for all men and women and non-binary people to be made in the image of God, then that God had to transcend anything that we understand as a gender role, and all ideas about gender identity and sexual orientation, they really go out the window if there is a God who created all human beings in the likeness of that God. And so it's that expansive idea. The more we let God out of that rigid box that we have, then the better off we're going to be, because we're going to be able to see divinity reflected in all humanity around us, not just some of the humanity around us.
And the repression of women because of what they consider to be the fault of Eve in the garden.
Exactly. You see this subtle or overt misogyny in so much of the religious teachings, and that bleeds over into the homophobia and the transphobia. And it's that again, that male heteronormative identity of God is just such an easy thing to let seep into our subconscious.
My guest is Pastor John Pavlovitz. His book is called If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, Finding a Faith That Makes Us Better Humans. We'll be back with more after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
To some, a baby's babbling doesn't mean much, but it does. Especially if there's no babbling at all. Little to no babbling by 12 months or later is just one of the possible signs of autism in children. Learn more at autismspeaks.org. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
More than 24 million Americans have an autoimmune disorder, and that number continues to grow. I'm Sharon Saylor, and I'm one of those 24 million. To put that number in perspective, cancer affects about 9 million and heart disease up to 22 million. That's why I've brought together top experts and those thriving regardless of their diagnosis to bring you the latest, most up-to-date information. Join me, Sharon Saylor, Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, for the Autoimmune Hour on Life Interrupted Radio to find out how to live your life uninterrupted.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Fuhrman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
He was the heart of your family, and he taught you our history. He helped you fix your first flat. He was the best backyard DJ around. And every time he'd tell a story, he'd own the room. But now more than ever, he may feel alone. Today, older adults and their loved ones are struggling to connect in a time when connection has never been more important. But there is something we can do. Embrace our older loved ones through StoryCorps Connect. With StoryCorps Connect, you can honor seniors remotely with an interview about their life. Every interview will be archived at the Library of Congress, becoming part of American history, so that years from now, future generations can listen in.
All right, Grandpa, what's one piece of advice you have for me?
Just 3 words, sweetheart. Live with courage.
The man that had the best stories still has plenty of stories to tell. So connect virtually and share the conversation of a lifetime at StoryCorpsConnect.org/AARP. Connect, honor, share. StoryCorps Connect. A message from AARP, StoryCorps, and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Pastor John Pavlovitz. He's the author of If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, Finding a Faith That Makes Us Better Humans. John, how has conservative Christianity's fixation on abortion and lack of consistent pro-life ethics affected the church?
I think it's allowed people who consider themselves religious and who aspire to be decent people, it's allowed them to tell themselves a story that if they simply oppose abortion, that they are pro-life. And I try to expand the definition of pro-life and use the words for humanity. And what I see in so much of religion and politics is a contempt and an aggression toward so much of diverse humanity, whether it's Muslim or LGBTQ or people of color or uninsured people or immigrants, that it allows people an easy activism. They can feel like they're advocates for life and yet really not love people who are different from them, who make them uncomfortable. And being simply against abortion doesn't require anyone to have real introspection and ask themselves, how am I harming people and how can I move in the world in such a way that I alleviate pain and suffering. And so it doesn't require any self-examination, self-awareness, and no understanding of privilege. And so the more you do that work, the more you see there are so many ways that life is assailed right now that we should be paying attention to those things.
Is Christian nationalism antithetical to the expansive message of Jesus?
Oh, there's no question. We look at a verse that so many Christians use that says, "For God so loved the world," and if that's true, then God's affections and intentions are so much greater than one nation, that God is planet-sized. And so the things that we care about should be as well, that we should have, we should love the environment because it is global, that we should love all people. And I think that's the sad part about this narrow religion with a small God, is that it censors out so many beautiful stories and people who have so much to teach us and so much wisdom that we could be enjoying, and it robs us of that.
Which leads to the question, are those who regard the Christian Bible as the end-all, be-all, literal word of God missing something?
I think all our religious traditions, they're important, and I love mine. And I think what we've been talking about and what I talk about in the book is small religion that really is territorial and parochial. And most religion is ultimately small religion. Our systems are really too small to contain whatever, the love that holds us all, as I like to say. And the moment we have a text in front of us that we believe is all the right answers, and it has the answers right, and the other system has the answers wrong, there's no way we can approach people in a sense, a posture of curiosity or an idea or a spirit of oneness. And I think so I've embraced that. I love my faith tradition, but my faith tradition, I don't worship that tradition. I'm not beholden to that tradition. It gives me a language for things that ultimately are ineffable, that I can't describe. And so I'm going to do the best I can with that. But ultimately, we're talking about something far bigger than whatever system we're a part of.
What other liturgy have you studied?
Well, I've been fortunate to be part of so many interfaith communities, and having worked with Muslim youth groups and being a part of, there's a wonderful community I write about in the book called Beit Shuva, which is a Jewish addiction treatment center, and it pulls in parts of the Christian story and parts of Judaism and New Age concepts, and it's really powerful to see all of these different communities have at their core this really inherent beauty. And I think when we are at the elemental, the best parts of every faith tradition, as you said earlier, we find that love is the core. It's whatever we put on it, the extraneous things that we build. And my experience has been the more we do interfaith work, the more we tap into not only the vastness of divinity, but the divinity in all humanity.
Absolutely. In your opinion, what does organized Christianity look like in 50 years?
I think you're always going to have people who need to be part of a system that they can feel comfortable with, that's controllable, that has some measure of repetition to it. And I think there'll always be people who want to go to a building for an hour on Sunday. I think in 50 years, though, the vast majority of people who are part of organized religion right now are going to be outside of those buildings. In the work that I do, I'm fortunate enough to cross paths with hundreds of thousands of people every month who are living deeply spiritual lives and love community and want to be a part of building a better planet, but they're not in a house of worship on a Saturday or Sunday. And so they're not really counted amongst organized religion. And I think that we're just going to keep moving that way. We're going to express our spirituality in different settings and different ways than we've done for hundreds of years.
With all of the division and partisan politics and religious tribalism we're experiencing, what do you see as the greatest reasons for hope?
I think when I as a parent, I look at my children and I see that younger generations who are not steeped in this really conservative orthodoxy of any kind, they have a different understanding of sexuality and a different understanding of race that isn't as tribal as we have grown up in. And so I see the hope there. I see so many people who are rejecting bigotry and rejecting phobic religion. I think there's always going to be a small segment of the population that needs to leverage that fear and needs to traffic in that prejudice. But the hope for me comes in people every day saying, I'm so exhausted by hatred and I want something better, and are trying to figure out how to make that happen.
What would you like readers to take away from If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk?
I think, Victor, I don't need them to agree with me theologically or politically at the end of the book. I just want the book to move them from wherever they are when they begin to a place of greater empathy, that they begin asking themselves deeper questions, that they wrestle with the tensions that they find there, and then they move in response in whatever way they feel called to. I just love the idea that someone reading this book will begin with a feeling that we don't have a lot in common, and yet realize that that's quite the opposite, and that the interdependence is the point.
One of the blessings of my experience in the interfaith community and having attended the New Seminary back in the 1990s was learning of a concept. There's a term an expression in Hebrew, hakol beseda, which the literal translation is out of chaos, order. But my mentor and teacher used to say it goes beyond that. That if you look with spiritual eyes, everything is folding in divine order. He said you may not see it. He says sometimes within the snippet of time, things don't appear to be that way, that ultimately, in the long range, there is this order taking place. And if we embrace that order, it's for the highest good of all. Do you agree to that?
I've often leaned on the idea of the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, which is similar. But what that says to me is I am alive at this place in time in the history of the planet. And so I am responsible to participate in that bending of the moral arc toward justice. So I can't assume that others are going to do that. And I can't assume that they're just going to bend on their own. We have gifts and passions and talents, and that's why we're here. So I take some ownership in being a co-creator of that beautiful possibility.
Absolutely. Beautifully said. Thank you for saying that. You have a wonderful blog on your website, Stuff That Needs to Be Said. What kind of stuff needs to be said?
Maybe not as much as I say. My wife would say, does that really need to be said? I think the title of the blog for me began by me asking, as a pastor, what do I not feel free to say because of the constraints of the system? And if I were completely honest and transparent, what would I be saying? And so everyone decides for themselves those things. And people who read the blog say, oh, it's really courageous that you say these things. And it's really not about that. It's about being the most honest version of myself. And I love the blog because I get to argue with my former self. I get to publicly say, I really thought this was where I was at the time. I was as honest as I could be, but I've grown. And so here I am today. And I think I'd love if more pastors lived that way and more people of faith lived that way.
It's really about growing and learning as we grow, and learning not only from the mind, but learning from the heart.
Yes. And I know 24 hours more about living than the guy who was here yesterday at this time. And that's okay if some of that has made me wince at what I said or did yesterday. I would hope that I do. And I would hope that in a year from now, I disagree with this version of myself, because it means I've had new experiences and I've learned something.
And I think ultimately that is what our Creator had for us in mind.
That there's something beautiful about the passage of time, that as difficult as it is, we always look back retrospectively and see where the growth has been and see what we've come through. And that's the beauty of the next day. If we wake up tomorrow and we get sunlight, then we have another opportunity to figure it out a little bit more.
Absolutely. And just to close, my teacher used to say that he would wake up every morning. He was in his 80s at the time. And he'd have tremendous pain in his legs and throughout his body. And he'd praise God. And people would say, why are you praising God for being in pain? He said, because I'm alive. And as long as I'm alive, I have another day to go out and do good works in the world. What a wonderful philosophy, huh?
Amen. That's the whole point. You know, we all have wounds and we all have limps, but we do this. We get up every day. I call it playing hurt in the book. And we're all playing hurt, but we're still playing.
Absolutely. My guest, Pastor John Pavlovitz, his book, If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, Finding a Faith That Makes Us Better Humans. John, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you.
They can go to johnpavlovitz.com or John Pavlovitz on most social media platforms, or wherever you get your favorite books. You should be able to find something there, and that'd be great.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing this wonderful and very positive message.
So good to be with you, Victor. Thanks so much.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.